I've been living out here in rural Mississippi for the past 6 years now, and it's pretty common to hear a variety of different animal noises. Still, I can never pinpoint an animal to the sound that I've been listening to lately. It's pretty common to hear coyotes like that all the time, and my partner wants to say that this was a coyote, but let's be honest. A coyote doesn't sound like a dinosaur screaming. I only hear the sound at night, but it seems like I'm living in Jurassic Park. If you ever have seen the movie Jurassic Park, there are multiple times throughout each film where a dinosaur roars or makes a noise, and it just has this reptilian sound to it, where if you are blindfolded, and even though the T-Rex sound, for example, is made up of a few different tones, if you've ever watched a documentary on the making of it, it still sounds like it's coming from a large reptile or a dinosaur. I'm telling you this and including this in my email because that's the only way I can accurately describe and explain how this sounds. It sounds nothing like a coyote, and my partner seems to want to disagree with me. I don't know if it's because he's scared or what the deal is. It does not sound natural, and it is not anything that I've ever heard before. We live close to a rather large part of swampland, so already that's a strike against us. I've listened to all sorts of weird horror stories about people getting lost in the swamps, and all the monsters that are supposed to be living in the swamp. Quote-unquote monsters. And then I start hearing this at night. I don't believe monsters are real necessarily. I think I'm probably just hearing an unidentified animal, in my honest opinion. Still, scientifically, I've never heard any animal sound as loud as this, or matching this exact animal's timbre. I don't know how much you know about giant reptiles that live in swamps, but it almost has this hissing quality. As I'm typing this to you, I'm trying to sit here and think of what animal I can explain to you that would make the most sense. If you've ever heard a Komodo dragon, for example, they have this deep roar, angry groan, hiss sound. That's not quite what I'm hearing, but imagine that amplified, with more of a roar, guttural quality behind it. Now you're starting to get close to what I'm hearing. Again, a reptile sounds like a reptile, and there's no mistaking that. I'm sorry if this email is too long. It's just been really scaring me lately. So I thought I would reach out to several different big YouTubers, because with all these stories you guys get sent, I'm sure you get knowledge and are able to clarify some things that might be out there or possibly be unknown to man. A couple of years ago, some friends that we've made since moving up here told us about some Bigfoot encounters they've been having in the same area. Now, I'm not a believer in Bigfoot by any means, but their encounters and sightings were frightening with how they'd retell their stories. I guess Bigfoots run rampant out here, but I didn't know that before moving out here. I thought to myself that it could be a Bigfoot that I'm hearing out here in the swamps at night, but from what I've been told, and from what little I know about Bigfoot in general, they don't sound reptilian. Maybe they do. Hopefully you can answer me and reply. Perhaps it's an entirely new discovered species of animal that's only living here in the Mississippi swampland. I have held on to this encounter for a very long time, and I haven't told anybody about it because I fear I would be mocked and called crazy. But maybe it's about time for me to finally share my experience with the world. After listening to all the stories people have shared with you, it's really encouraged me to step up and share what happened to me back in the late summer of 1979 in Columbus, Mississippi. Your video series about reptilians is precisely what I wanted to talk about. Until recently, the past 6 months, I had no idea that there was anybody else out there who has seen a creature like I have. People talk about Bigfoot, and even I've heard about a thing called a Mothman, but I never would have guessed that other people have seen large reptilian humanoid creatures just like I did. I thought I was crazy because I thought I was the only one. I've never been into conspiracies or wanting to dive down that rabbit hole, but the more I listen to some of these stories, the more real this all makes it seem, and the more it all brings me back to that evening. I could tell you, it was July 10th in 1979, and it was beginning to get dusk. I lived out of a small house that I was rooming with a few friends. I'd only been there for around a few months, and by nature, I'm a small town boy from Colorado. So a few friends of mine moved out here to start up a small business, and they really wanted me on the team to work in their department. I didn't have a job at the time, so I thought it would have been the perfect fit. Rooming with some friends, working at the same position. We could party and work together. What more of a life could you want at only 22 years old? Now, you need to understand something. At the time where I was living, it wasn't fully developed like everything is nowadays with stores and businesses everywhere. Commercial real estate in general has very much expanded in just about every area. Back then, this was about as rural as you can get, with only a few plots of land here and there, and with houses sparsely spread. At the time, there was only a few other houses in the area, with mainly large empty fields and thick woods all around. You bet it was humid as hell. Our drive to work was approximately 25 minutes, which we enjoyed, because that means we could party and be as loud as we want to, without having angry neighbors calling the police on us. In fact, that's actually one of the reasons why we decided to go in and rent this house together. If you look out from the front door, it goes out all the way to the front road, and beyond that, it dips down in a small embankment to a thick grassy field that goes on for acres and acres into more and more denser woods. You can call it an empty meadow, because the only thing that's really there is probably some marshland and some really, really tall grass. At the time, there was zero development, and the closest house is probably a half-mile down the road in either direction. Again, perfect for young kids in early 20s to party without disturbing anybody purposefully. And might I say that at that age, I drank like a pirate. At the time of the sighting, though, I was stone cold sober, and I really want to hone in on that. I was the only one home at the time, because my few other roommates were out doing something, I don't remember what. Probably out chasing girls like they always did when they weren't working. I was usually the more reserved one. I was outside having a cigarette, and I see this giant lizard stand up from the tall grass in the field opposite of the side of the house. I stared at it intently for a few seconds, just trying to comprehend what I was looking at. Then, it turned its head, and its whole body followed. It slowly began walking towards the woodline, which was probably about a few hundred yards. I watched this thing walk all the way towards the woodline before finally entering and disappearing. This thing looked like a Komodo dragon crossed with a human. It was dark and scaly looking and had long arms. It did have a tail, but because the grass was so tall, its lower body was obscured. I almost dropped my cigarette and thought to myself I'd just seen a lizard man. When I was outside smoking my cigarette and happened to see it, I wasn't necessarily looking for anything. I was just kind of spacing out, looking off in the distance, thinking about my day, when this thing rises up out of the tall grass. It was tall though, because that grass is easily 3 feet tall, and it only came up to about mid-thigh to this creature. That meant that it was probably around 7 to 8 feet tall, and it had a massive reptile head. I don't know if it actually saw me, or didn't, and just chose to ignore me, but it never looked over at me, and it's not like I was obscured by any trees or bushes. I was out there in the open, this small, tiny, skinny guy. We don't have any trees anywhere on the house of the yard, so I was sticking out if it would have looked over. I don't know if it was hunting or what it was doing, but it was obviously there before I even came out with a cigarette, crouching down in the grass. I was out there for probably 5 to 7 minutes before I saw this thing stand up and walk off. When it walked, it was just like a human. It had a very natural glide with long strides. It was incredibly muscly, and there wasn't, or at least looked to be, an ounce of fat on that thing at all. You could tell by the muscle mass that it was strong. It never made a noise, and I never smelled anything either. After it vanished into the trees, I dropped my cigarette like I said, and ran inside because even though I was in total awe at what I saw, I was pretty freaked out. I had no idea that we had upright walking lizards out here. Like I said, just being a small town boy from Colorado, this was way out of my environment. I didn't tell any of my friends when they got home later that night, and I kinda kept this encounter to myself for a really long time. But I do think about it from time to time. All these reptilian accounts you've been posting over the last few months have really brought me back to that moment, and I figured it was time for me to share mine. Now I know many of the accounts you share explain vastly different creatures, most of them acting very hostile and aggressive. While I don't think I saw any of those creatures you told, I definitely can stand behind the fact that it was an upright walking reptilian humanoid creature. It was very tall and enormous. I never saw it again after that, because the following year, I moved back to Colorado. Anyway, thank you for letting me share my experience with you.